Okay, suddenly the weather's turned kind of humid, but in a fairly positive place in terms of the pandemic and whatnot. So hopefully there are reasons for optimism and being upbeat, despite the weather going to get a lot worse. Okay, let's jump straight into the discussion of nation and place branding. And this is something we kicked off at the end of last week, but we've still got a fair bit to cover. As I posted to the class last night, my intention is to give a fair bit of attention to these issues, partly because they're so incredibly timely in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, uh, but also because there's something that everyone can get a bit of a feel for. I think we all understand the role of place brands and nation brands. They drive our preferences in terms of where we want to study abroad, where we'd like to live, questions of our own identity and as citizens of a nation, of residents of a city, and all of those kind of things. So I think it's easy to resonate with. And also, all governments and regions that I know of have been taking this stuff very seriously in recent years. But overwhelmingly, bureaucrats don't have the skill set or particularly a kind of a marketing mindset that you need to very effectively brand a destination. So there's a very significant growth in consultancies that are doing this. Dentsu Hakuhodo in the Japanese case have significant business sections that do this. They have national networks, of course, of salespeople, Egyo, out in the regions. Historically, they were selling advertising services and sometimes event production services to regional companies. But they saw a very significant business opportunity in pitching to everything from local governments to regional governments, chambers of commerce and whatnot, to try and sell their branding, place branding expertise. Of course, the huge boom in inbound tourism that we've experienced in Japan in recent years was a major driver of regional branding initiatives. How did you, how could you get more of these Nazo no Gaijin tourists to come to your destination? How could you present a unique pitch? Now, of course, the pandemic has been absolutely devastating to inbound tourism everywhere. It's effectively stopped. Pretty much foreigners cannot enter Japan now, which is a huge challenge in terms of the regional economies, but also presents some really interesting challenges too, in terms of how you restart place and nation branding when your policy position has effectively been, don't come, we won't let you in because you're a risk or a threat to our local community or a potential threat. But when things get over, when this is behind us, you're very welcome back. I'm very keen to hear your own reactions on that. We'll go into a breakout session and you can talk about that yourself, some of those issues, and we'll bring them back, and we'll then get you also to share some of your thoughts via the chat function as well to summarize some of the breakout discussions. Okay, so I'll throw up the slides. And again, I'm running through the PDFs as you have them yourselves. I think that's the simplest way to do it. Okay, so we finished up with the observation in the last class that those countries that actually allow their own citizens and even foreign citizens to sometimes play creatively with, even in a quite disrespectful way, some of the symbols of nation, ironically sometimes end up with ever stronger brands. One of the clearest instances of this is, of course, the Union Jack, the association of the Union Jack with punk culture, which became a huge stimulus to refreshing the brand of the UK. We saw Tony Blair, the Prime Minister in the 1990s, for a while supported a campaign under the logo, although it was an informal kind of logo, Cool Britannia. And that actually, the title came about because of a journalist comment. And then another journalist, American journalist writing about Japan, picked up that notion and applied it to Japan and Cool Japan. Of course, the difference in Japan is that a whole bunch of bureaucrats took that quite literally and assumed, oh, we're cool now. And so started branding Japan literally as cool, and the METI, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, actually has a Cool Japan office. Ministry of Foreign Affairs was more wary about that. They've done old style public diplomacy and they were hesitant, very, very hesitant to embrace the Cool Japan discourse, but they recognize it is a significant phenomena. So we want to think about the very diverse sources of nation and place brand power. You can't make a brand from nothing. But of course, all societies have their own very distinct culture. They often have quite strong individual company brands. And there's always an interesting question of the interdependence of the company brand and the nation brand. So let's have a look at some of these elements. We can get at them when we look at how companies actually use their origin brand, their home country brand, to leverage their own corporate brand. So that gives us some clues as to those on the creative side, what they think about the particular nation and brand resources here. Of course, companies that do bad things abroad can damage a national brand. And this is actually one reason why there are a lot of restrictions, even in the form of actual export controls. See, in the Australian case, you cannot export beef or wheat or a range of other commodities without the approval of the government, because there is this very strong sense that if some beef was to be exported to Japan, for example, and it had chemical residues, or in the past when they were worried about mad cow disease or any of these other biohazard issues, that one dodgy exporter could damage the entire national brand for all the good producers. So you see a lot of countries controlling key exports when the product can't be routinely differentiated. It's very difficult to tell the difference between one piece of raw steak and another piece of raw steak in a supermarket. And we also see that the industry associations from particular national countries spend a lot of money actually branding these otherwise kind of generic products. So you can see plenty of campaigns done in Japan for US beef, for Aussie beef, for example. Many, many years ago, when I first came to Japan, people, when they heard I was from Australia, they would go Aussie, and I really didn't know what they were talking about, and eventually figured it out that they were referencing a campaign that the Australian Meat and Livestock Corporation had done to promote Australian beef there for a while. So it's sometimes export controls. Very often it relates to basic labeling. So we see in the French case, France has led the world in this in terms of very strong place of origin labeling. You cannot put champagne on a bubbly drink that is made in any place other than the region of Champagne. So similarly, a whole range of regional brands, everything from cheese, processed meats, sausages, and very strikingly wine. Wine is the most familiar there. And they often get highly prescriptive, not only about where it's produced, but what's actually in it. This is actually quite controversial. So wines from a certain region have to have a mix of a certain kinds of grapes, or maybe can't include any other kinds of grapes. And we do see that even some producers locally find those elements are too restrictive. And if they can't win the argument in their own trade association to change that, they sometimes also invest in other regions to make the products they want. So we see some of the pioneers, for example, in developing very good wineries in the south of France, and particularly the southwest, are often entrepreneurs who have their whole career background and business stakes in other areas, particularly in the Bordeaux region. So they want to do different kinds of wines, maybe for a different kind of market, or just to simply something that follows their own aesthetic preferences. And so they also invest in winery capacity in a different region to give them actually more productive freedom. So we do see, and I've in the perception section of the website, which is topic 7, you can see that I've got a number of examples of in-flight videos, and they're there for two purposes. One, they connect nicely to this broader set of issues of place branding with typically what we call flagship carriers, national carriers, that historically they literally had the flag of the country on them, and they're often owned by the government. But also the in-flight video is one of those things where if you've taken a lot of flights, you think, yeah, whatever, I know this. And so you don't bother paying attention to it. In fact, it's almost a point of pride that the people who are watching the video carefully, the ones who don't travel very much. So often a little bit of kind of self-identity snobbery kicks in and says, I don't need to see a safety video. So one of the challenges actually from a safety perspective is to get regular travelers to re-engage with the safety message. Just simply to refresh it in their own minds. So a lot of creative efforts are done there. And at the same time, they want to communicate the destination brand element associated with the airline. Of course, when airlines market themselves, they are so fundamentally tied to their country of origin, particularly the regulation of landing rights, the way it works. They're almost exclusively bilateral, except in the European context where you have an open skies agreement, and then that has been extended to some other places. So effectively, airlines traditionally have had their hubs in their home country, and it's been very much a hub and spokes model. So that even if people are going between third countries, so not, say, for example, to France, if they're using Air France to get from Tokyo to Berlin, for example, they're still transiting through Paris-Charles de Gaulle, which can be a rather mixed experience. I adore France, but I'm not a huge fan of Paris-Charles de Gaulle Airport, although they are trying to make it better. Although it does have some wonderful retro modernist mid-century architecture in part of it. But so we see that Air France, to sell themselves, really, particularly as a premium airline, want to leverage the resources that France has, the brand resources. And by the way, in the Air France case, they took over KLM, the Dutch national carrier, when KLM was in financial troubles. And they have this subtle differentiation strategy where Air France is a bit more premium priced and KLM is a bit more discount. Although one of the ironies of that is, for those of you who've used KLM, you would know that Amsterdam Schiphol Airport in many ways is a much nicer airport to actually transit through rather than Paris Charles de Gaulle. But there is this sense amongst the Air France management that the French brand is more promising in terms of premium positioning than the KLM brand. So the brand image of the Netherlands is of, very efficient, very reliable, but doesn't have the premium cachet perhaps that the French brand does. So in the particular video on the website, you can see France is in the air, and I've got some background videos that I put there on the site too, because in some ways, the song that they use very clearly references an old song from the 1970s that I used to hear all the time when I was a kid by an Australian singer, Jean-Paul Young, Love is in the Air, one of the big hits of the late 1970s. In fact, my mum was a very good artist, and she had such a crush on the singer. She actually did a really, really good sketch of him, actually. And I had a very bizarre experience. I was in a ultra-Orthodox area of Jerusalem and saw a whole lot of Hasidic Jewish men dancing to Love is in the Air, which is a little bit kind of surreal, this dissonance, disconnect from one's own nostalgia tied to place and where you are at the time. Anyway, there is actually legal action arisen now about the copyright issue about the origins of the song, which is then probably sampled, or at least a creative prompt for the American group that produced the track that's also on the YouTube on the site, and which Air France has then sampled for the video. The catch copy, France is in the air. Of course, many French might find this a little bit kind of surreal in a way, but we look at the particular images and we can see the use of a whole bunch of associations that will resonate emotionally with foreign audiences. Some of the images, of course, ballet, because of the institutionalization of ballet in France historically still, of course, the official language of the International Ballet Association, and the management of ballet, and still some of the top ballet schools in the world are centered in France. And of course, the Tour de France imagery here, fashion figures as well, and there are particular images there of the guy who's kissing the girl at the moment, but also has a camera, so that associates with the fashion parades and whatnot. And then all this, and also this really striking thing about France, this indelible association of France with love. Now, still, if you survey people all over the world and you say, where would be a really romantic destination to go on your honeymoon? Still, an astonishing proportion of people say Paris. There is this strong association with romance, France, Paris, and to the point where it actually causes Parisians a bit of a problem. You've got couples from all over the world bring their padlock and put it on the bridge and swear their undying love and then throw the key into the Seine. And actually, they have to go around from time to time and take off a whole bunch of the padlocks because structurally the weight of it is a problem for the bridge. The railings are in danger of kind of falling off. So we have these kind of associations, and France has a huge head start when it comes to nation branding because it can use these things. And of course, the airlines are going to take full advantage of that. You can see, although not right now, I will post an image on the blog feed on the website. You can see that over the last 2 years, Air France was doing some very targeted campaigns looking primarily to sell business class to affluent career women in Japan, particularly in Tokyo. They were doing a lot of billboard campaigns, bus stop campaigns, posters in railway stations and whatnot, which was very much centered on fashion, on style, a perceived French lifestyle, and this notion that it would be a very good thing to do to reward yourself on a direct flight to France, not via a third place that makes the journey so much longer. But if you've got the money and you've still got the aspirations to love, if you're out of four, but you haven't quite given up on love, then maybe going to Paris will be the escape from the pressures of work, and that you can go and have kind of kokoro no risetto. So revitalize yourself and come back and get on with life and hopefully find love as well. Good luck to you with that. Okay, so we also know that there are regional brands very strongly, and they sometimes become associated with lifestyles, and then also you can plug in some commercial brands as well. One of them, Pernod, is a traditional anise-based French drink, and it has a nice effect actually when you pour water in. It goes kind of cloudy, which is pretty cool in nightclub because it looks all blue and everything. But a very strong association with rural and southern France. There's a very famous British marketing executive who says Pernod is one of those things that tastes so good when you're on holiday in the south of France, but really, really shit when you're back in London. That there's just something about the place and the association is very good. He did say that Retsina, the pine wine from Greece, tastes incredibly bad even in Greece, although some Greeks would disagree. Now, I put on a website, I think, one of the most interesting, effective examples of building a nation brand through its very distinctive resources. And we can argue whether, in fact, how distinctive it is, but the particular package of them is distinctive in the New Zealand case. And then wrapping it up in a very clever bit of copy, Kutch copy, which is sufficiently open that you can put pretty much anything you want in there. So this is a very important thing with a strong branding campaign, that the brand has to have a lot of what we could call carrying capacity, that you can put a lot of different messages in there while keeping an overall coherence to the appearance of the branding campaign. So 100% pure New Zealand. Very clever, because the perception of New Zealand, of course, is that the environment is incredibly pure, that it is environmentally a very pure place. There's very little pollution. It's very healthy. And my experience of New Zealand is that generally that's actually true. Although in the suburbs of Auckland, sometimes you see a whole bunch of clapped out cars and you think, okay, this is 100% pure New Zealand, lots of like Heike gas, carbon monoxide. But generally, this is the brand image, and it's very easy to reinforce with images of nature. Of course, New Zealand is a very strong adventure tourism destination, particularly around places like Queenstown and the South Island, which has managed to achieve something that Japan, other than Niseko, hasn't really achieved, to become an all year round destination, not just a skiing, snowboarding destination. So they really managed to develop a whole bunch of things that were not distinctively New Zealand, but have been packaged as part of the New Zealand experience. Now, whether it's bungee jumping, whitewater rafting, mountain climbing, trekking, hang gliding, paragliding, all of these kind of things have been very effectively bundled together in terms of the New Zealand experience. Of course, what's distinctive in New Zealand is that it's got beautiful landscapes in so many ways that remind us of, say, Norway. In fact, whenever I'm in New Zealand, I think it looks like some of the really beautiful parts of Japan without the vending machines and pachinko parlors and power lines and 120 million people. It is strikingly familiar to those who also know Norway. Of course, what's distinctive in the New Zealand, or Australians always say the Kiwi case, is that it also has the Polynesian culture, Maori culture. New Zealand was settled in about the 900s, if I'm correct, by Polynesian migrants who traveled to New Zealand by canoe. By the way, there's a joke amongst the Australian rugby fans that no wonder the Kiwis, the All Blacks, are absolutely the best at rugby in the world. That if you ran your immigration policy based on who could get to the country by rowing an outrigger canoe across the ocean, then you would end up with genetically a pretty tough pool of people. Okay, so there may be something in that. So you've got this Polynesian culture, which has also been a huge branding resource for Hawaii. Hawaii is an astonishing brand phenomena. I have a bit of a working theory, by the way, that one reason ever since about Showa Yonju Nendai, why Hawaii has been such a strong brand, is that Polynesian, and particularly Hawaiian culture, is the kind of persona or personality that lots of Japanese would like to be. They'd like to be relaxed. They'd like to be chilled. They'd love to get into the aloha. But as we saw, statistically, Japan actually comes out as one of the highest countries in the world for neuroticism. So I think this is the aspirational alternative self. And one of the nice things when you go to Waikiki is you see large numbers of Japanese women, young and old, dressing in flowing bright dresses and very relaxed. Of course, they would never wear them in Tokyo. But there is this place you go to find your alter ego. And to some degree in New Zealand, I think it taps a similar kind of thing. What's a little bit different between the Polynesian Hawaiian brand and the Maori brand in New Zealand is that the fierce warrior tradition has also been played up. Now, of course, that's in the Polynesian tradition in Hawaii as well, too, and there were repeated rebellions against initial British rule of the place. But particularly in the Maori context, this very strong tradition of Maori warriors. And of course, you see that represented in the haka, the chant, the war chant of the All Black rugby team. So anyways, they've got this very strong brand. And it's been going for about 15 years, but there's this need to continually refresh it at various touch points. And so this very nice video, if you haven't had a chance to look at, I really encourage you to look at, which talks about how they wanted to reinforce both the look of it, but also to put more content into the 100% pure New Zealand to emphasize the Maori element of their culture, but also to emphasize hospitality. And so that's a significant part of what they've done there. So engage with that video. I'd say on the other hand that Australia is one never-ending trail of embarrassment in terms of its nation branding. You'll see the video online. A notorious flop of a campaign. So where the bloody hell are you? the person who was actually responsible for head of this at the head of the Australian Tourism Commission at the time is actually the current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. He got the job for political reasons. He wasn't a marketing guy. And then they put out this "So where the bloody hell are you" campaign. It's wrongly been said, it says on YouTube, that this was banned. In the UK, it wasn't. It was just pulled after a feedback which said that it was thought pretty tacky. If it was ever going to work, it was going to work in the UK amongst the working class market. But in other markets, it just didn't resonate. I remember seeing a poster on the Tokyo subway that had "So where the bloody hell are you?" And they hadn't even tried to translate it into Japanese because it just doesn't come across. I remember thinking, oh my God, we see some other examples here of controversy. The Austrade, the Australian Tourism Association, this is until recently their logo, Australia Unlimited. Yeah, okay. Maybe not too bad. And I'm not going to get rude here, but if you see this as a man with his hands on his hips, wearing a watch on his left hand and not wearing any trousers, then Australia Unlimited looks kind of troubling. And once you have that imagery in mind, it's very, very difficult to get it out. So one of the things I've put in the checklist for very effective messaging in our topic for this week under perception, it's our very last slide, is that you have to kind of prank proof your branding, your logo. And if your logo can be misrepresented as something rude, you've got a problem. Because once you see something in an unintended but interesting kind of way, you will never unsee it. Now, the most recent attempt, this is quite controversial. The production standards are very high. They've spent a fortune. They've got a bunch of very prominent Australian actors and singers, identities and whatnot to cooperate with the campaign. And they've all wrapped it around this notion of philosophy. So an Australian philosophy of life, and come and live our philosophy. One of the problems, of course, is Australia was very quick to close its borders with the pandemic. This is only a few months after the campaign started. And we actually have several 100,000 people holding a valid student visa who can't currently re-enter Australia. Although at one point, and actually it is still possible, but you can, if you went to a third country that wasn't on a list, you could enter Australia. And so we had some Chinese students who went and spent 2 weeks in Dubai, for example, and then came to Australia. But the broader problem and the big debate in Australia is, making up a word and also trying to associate Australia with philosophy in the first place. This is a huge dilemma with branding. Do you try and upend established perceptions of a destination? Now, Australia generally is considered to be, in so much research shows this, obviously, big, interesting environment, enormous place, generally friendly people. Don't know, but generally friendly people. But we're not largely associated with philosophy. Okay, if you were to speak philosophy, people would think either maybe Princeton or obviously Oxbridge, for example, or clearly France with all those postmodernist scholars. So, and so many of the great scholars in history, great philosophers in history from France or from Germany, for example. So yes, you want to change people's perceptions, but this has been an ongoing issue for Australian universities. How do you actually market the destination for high-level educational services when people tend to associate you as a relaxed, easygoing, lifestyle kind of oriented destination? Historically, by the way, that's why in some markets, Australian universities attracted many more young women than they did men. Out of Taiwan, for example, many Taiwanese parents thought Australia would be a good place to send their daughters, but they want their sons to go to Los Angeles or ideally Stanford. Every Taiwanese parent wants their kid to go to Stanford, for example. So interesting sets of issues with that. You can look at the campaign logos there. Now, there is an interesting set of dynamics in terms of resources, place brand resources, that often arise in an unintended kind of way. Now, I'm worried you're all going to come around for a coffee if I say this, but I'm quite happy to see you around here. This is about 150 meters from my townhouse. I walked just by here before. Okay. This is the steps by Sugajinja in Yotsuya. Okay. Sugacho. And people often refer to it as a Yotsuya Kaidan because there's actually a very famous kind of ghost story, Yotsuya Kaidan. It's actually a different story. Until the pandemic came along, the top of these stairs at Yotsuya there, at Sugajinja, was always crowded. You had various waves of tourists, whether it was Thais, Hong Kong Chinese, mainland Chinese, Japanese tourists, coming to this particular site and reproducing this scene. So typically I have the phone in one hand and I've got people kind of posing, and I'd be curious to hear if anyone's actually been to this place and done this themselves. You can find a vast collection of shots online where people have posted to Facebook or Instagram or whatever that they've done this, and lots of videos. The director, by the way, he has a thing for Roppongi Hills. Now, you cannot see Roppongi Hills here. This is actually in that direction. It's actually Ichigaya. So Roppongi Hills is actually behind, but he always kind of drops that in the background. Other than that, it's actually quite remarkably active, remarkable depiction of the place. This very boroi apartment down here, there's a quite scary guy with a mongrel of a dog, and for some bizarre reason he's just put a string of neon lights up his stairs which blink 24/7, and I'm sure the poor neighbors are traumatized by it but cannot talk to the guy because he's got a dog that would tear you apart. So clearly those depictions in creative product that become popular overseas can produce remarkable flows of people. And sometimes that's designed. For the most part, it's accidental. There is a bit of a push now to try and subsidize film production in locations in order to try and capture some of these spillover effects, or in Japanese official circles, it's spoken about as ripple effects. I want to emphasize, though, that also there's a lot of cultural diplomacy that's done by using cultural resources of countries very deliberately. And this is a particular example. This is Sengai. He was a very famous, very interesting Buddhist priest in the Edo period who did a lot of often very playful paintings, as well as some very iconic Buddhist image, particularly this one that we see here on the right of the Maru Sankaku Shikaku. And indeed, the former chief designer of Nissan, when he came and spoke, Nakamura Shiro, when he spoke at the Waseda class that I run, the corporate case study, he actually showed exactly this image. And he said that this was very influential when they were thinking about designing their cars. The march was the Maru, the cube was the Shikaku, and then another model was the Sankaku. Now, why do I mention this as cultural diplomacy, why it can work? Well, this was a huge influence upon me when I was a university student. When I was an undergraduate, I remember seeing that there was a Sengai touring exhibition that came to the Queensland Art Gallery, and it was funded by the Japanese company Idemitsu Kosamai. Idemitsu is, you might know it from the gasoline stand. They're a major trader of energy, and they're a major investor in Australia in the late 1980s. And there was a lot of political controversy in Australia about Japanese investment. In the end, the politicians of the day showed very strong leadership and advocated for a liberal foreign investment policy. But the companies themselves felt that they really need to do something to boost Japan's brand image, particularly because, of course, of the war history between Australia and Japan. After European settlement and the forming of the nation of Australia, the only country that's ever attacked Australia was actually Japan. Now, 1957, there was a Treaty of Commerce, and all that history by the leaders was put behind them. But it's always something that can be tapped by nationalists. So a number of Japanese companies, and particularly Idemitsu, were very active in promoting cultural diplomacy. And Idemitz is striking because the founder of the company was an avid art collector. And with his collection, he then created a museum, which is in Marunouchi, the Idemitsu Museum. And once you can go there, I strongly recommend you do go. They have superb collection, but also they have a wonderful view all over the Imperial Palace. And also it's a real retro mid-60s building. So the architecture itself is actually very pleasant. Anyway, so I saw this exhibition, loved it so much, I bought the poster. I have the poster in my vessel, my apartment in a ski field in Niigata. And I had a visiting Australian architecture professor who's married to a Japanese, speaks excellent Japanese, loves Japan. He came to stay in my apartment and he walked in and he said, "Oh my God, I have exactly the same poster. I had this poster in my bedroom when I was a university student. They brought the exhibition to Adelaide and it made me fall in love with Japan." And so the both of us looked at each other and just said, "Yep, orimo." Wow, cultural diplomacy really can work. So these kind of initiatives, these private sector initiatives to use cultural product can be effective. Now, I want to present a simple example of the interdependence of nation brand and place brand. Denmark, okay, that's me in front of Denmark, okay, which is a major art museum in Copenhagen. And when you go into the Danish art section, they've got a huge stylized Denmark across the front. What's really striking, one of the potent factors in Denmark's national branding is the high concentration of designers, particularly in the mid-century period after World War II, who gave a very strong, distinctive Danish sensibility to the world at large. So whether it's lighting design, for example, or one of my great heroes, Hans Wehner. I have the small chair. I sit on it every day when I'm working at home. When I retire, I want the big chair. It's in Japan, it's about 120 man, about $12,000, okay? But we also see that the Danish brand has been continuously refreshed by new designers, new creators. René Redzepi, you might know of Noma. It won World's Best Restaurant award for several years in a row. And he actually did a pop-up restaurant here in Tokyo. And it was, although it was open for about 6 months, it was booked out within hours of bookings being available. René Redzepi, a real pioneer of new Nordic cuisine, which has been a very interesting dynamic, and they've been labeled under the Nordic brand because it extends to Sweden and to Norway, although much of the dynamism has come out of Copenhagen. So what's particularly interesting with René Redzepi is he actually is of migrant heritage. So his family are from Macedonia. And he used to go back to Macedonia in the summer holidays, stayed with grandparents, and Macedonia is still a very poor country, a very beautiful country. It's now officially called North Macedonia, part of the former Yugoslavia. And he had this very strong sense of when he stayed with his grandparents that everything they ate, they either foraged or grew. And he thought, well, you know, Denmark is famous for its pork, and it's you know, meatballs and mashed potato and whatnot, but it has a beautiful natural environment. Maybe we could do something similar in terms of a food culture. He had experiences in a number of prominent international restaurants as a young staff member, but he established Norma before he was 30, and he has done an enormous amount to build the Nordic cuisine brand and really boost the Copenhagen and the Danish brand, to the point where is if you go to the one-stop denmark.k shop, where you can see everything here, visit, study, invest, work. It's a one-stop shop from the Danish government selling the Danish destination. You can see that he figures right at the top there. Okay. Now, if we look at rankings, there are a whole bunch of rankings for brands, but also a bunch of interesting publications. Now, as you all are part of the global cosmopolitan mobile class, well, mobile again, once we get this pandemic behind us, you all have to have some familiarity with Monocle magazine, which has kind of become the Bible of the mobile global professional types. So they very much emphasize soft power, nation branding. The founder of it, he previously founded the magazine Wallpaper. He is a guy called Tyler Cohen. He realized that there were really no good magazines which brought together serious writing as well as things like interior design and a whole range of things. So effectively lifestyle magazines with good writing. And he realized that when he was hospitalized for about 9 months, he had been a journalist with the BBC in Afghanistan, and he got shot. Well, got shot twice, but in one incident. And so he spent months and months in hospital. Then he made the Wallpaper magazine, and it sold that for a huge profit. And he had a non-compete clause, so he couldn't make another magazine for a while. So he created a business called Wink Creative, which is a consultancy business. They do a lot of work for airlines, for cities, and even for nations to promote the destination branding. And then once his non-compete clause was up, he could create the Monocle magazine. Now, this is one brand index. It's called Future Brand. They're most significant in terms of doing consultancy work on brand impact for companies. But for a while, they were putting out significant rankings. The last couple of years, they've stopped doing it. Well, there's been a pause. The last time they did it, Japan came in #1, which is very interesting. And if we can look at the dimensions, it gives us some interesting clues about the relative strengths. They split status and experience and whatnot. We see that Japan, very strong reputation for made in Japan, very strong in terms of heritage and culture, Japanese distinctiveness, very interesting destination, very good for business. Although this is interesting because they survey mobile professionals, but other studies of senior executives, their perceptions of doing business in Japan often say too bureaucratic, but the general perception is it's good for business. Much lower in terms of quality of life, but it all nonetheless adds up to Japan having been the strongest brand. But what is really significant is in these kind of research, we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose? Clearly, Japan's brand strengths are great if you want to sell Japan as a tourism destination. If, on the other hand, you want to sell Japan as a place to migrate to, as a migrant destination, then it's rather more problematic. Because when you do a deep dive into it, you see that in terms of values, perceived freedom, for example, then, Japan does relatively poorly. But as a experience destination, it's very attractive. By the way, even top branding agencies make mistakes. Very often they have very good quant people and analysts, and then they have some rather slacker people on doing some of the presentational things. Gastronomy is spelt incorrectly, for example, and samurai is samuri. Okay. This question of uniqueness is interesting. I remember my parents used to get quite annoyed me when I was young because they're both high school teachers. And I had this habit of saying, yeah, it's sort of unique, somewhat unique. And both mum and dad would be in a competition to say, it's unique or it's not. There's no degrees of uniqueness. And I'm still struggling with that, but that's burned into my brain. But what is very clear in terms of surveys of Japan, it's perceived as unique culturally. Being in Japan is unique. And it's seen to have a very strong heritage, and that heritage is continuing. So Japan is unchanging in many ways. So Japan's brand strength is effectively that it's considered to be very contemporary in terms of technology and business, but it has this unchanging cultural element. The downside of uniqueness is that the flip side can be that it doesn't change very easily. So it may not be so receptive to embracing the new, particularly foreigners who want to make it their base long term. And if you look at this splatter representation here, we see that one of Japan's greatest weaknesses is in terms of perceived tolerance. Okay, does quite well on safety and security. Interestingly, Japanese would think that this would be way out here. Safety and security is not as quite strongly perceived as a lot of people would imagine. Advanced technology is seen to be very much one of Japan's greatest strengths. So there is an interesting kind of a paradox in that this perception of technology and also very good top tier firms often lags behind the realities. You know, we look at some of the companies here, absolutely, it's true in some areas, Toyota, Hitachi, for example, Honda, but you know, Panasonic, Toshiba, Sony, for a number of years really struggled financially. Clearly, they still have leading technologies, but transferring that into corporate success, profits, has been a huge challenge. And we can also see in Japan that so many emerging sectors, emerging products, where you've had to cross industry boundaries and create new things, new collaborations, Japan has been a lot weaker. You know, for 20 years, the debate was, you know, why wasn't Sony like Apple? You know, so why couldn't Sony achieve what Apple had done to be such a comprehensive marrier of hardware and software? Because that's exactly what Sony's strategic vision was. And in so many things, whether it's drones, whether it's gimbal, you know, you see a whole bunch of other companies. Gimbal are those things like the Osmo Mobile, for example, or the Osmo Pocket, made by a Chinese company, DJI, which is also a strong drone manufacturer, that have absolutely dominated certain market segments. And Japan, despite having the world's best components, whether it's small cameras, small motors, and whatnot, has simply ceded much of that product space to other companies. So when we dive a little bit more closely into here, you can see that overall brands sometimes don't fully capture the respect that Japan gets amongst experts. So fashion doesn't rate so highly in terms of overall survey. But if you go and actually interview people in the fashion industry, they have huge respect for very artisanal Japanese producers of things like denim, which absolutely dominates the high-end fashion industry, where you use denim, out of places like Kurashiki, and a whole bunch of boutique designers that get a lot of respect. So I just want to very briefly mention a case study, one that I was directly involved with for a while, actually, and I'll go through it very quickly because you can read this. After the 3/11 disaster, there was a lot of money to be spent by the government to try and rebrand Japan. And for the first time, they had the Cabinet Office take initiative to do this. And actually, they came to Waseda, Dentsu was involved, and I ended up running the kind of Japan rebranding campaign events in Australia. So, but Ministry of Foreign Affairs was kind of sidelined on a lot of this stuff. They did a logo, very quickly commissioned a logo, and then a whole bunch of issues that kind of came about. They had Kashiwa Sato Kashiwa, a very prominent design. But this is a classic example of the bureaucrats not knowing what they don't know. They announced the winner of the design competition from 99 Designs, but when people heard that, they nearly choked, because 99 Designs is a very famous site where people can hire designers from all over the world. And so there's a lot of designers working from poorer countries who will do logos, other graphic design for clients relatively cheaply, regardless of where they are. Message was, the copy was Japan next, and they had this kind of Powerball, kind of fireball or flying cannon, kind of cannonball kind of image, okay? And we see the text taking our delicate sensitivity across the world. As a catch copy, to talk about your own delicate sensitivity, probably a bit immodest. Very quickly ended up in a very messy legal case, because this is the Japan Olympic Committee logo. And of course, for a very prominent designer like Sato-san, this was awkward, okay? The other thing is next. This was just so lazy. I just grabbed some of the examples here that, I don't know, if you're not paying enough or not being tough enough on Dentsu, it seems for so many companies, they'll give you a next, okay? So we get next everywhere, okay? So many of them. So whenever you can't think of what we're going to do next, you use next in your branding. Even companies that should have a lot of creative capability. Fuji Telebi next, okay? Daiwa, okay? life next, blah, blah, blah. Even put it in company names, Fritz, Hikari next, okay? Endless next. So don't be lazy. Now, I would love to have done this ideation capture thing in terms of brand Japan with you. We've done it year after year, and you can see a whole bunch of happy people snapping the results when we did this, okay? Brainstorming adjectives pertaining to Japan. Now, this is an interesting way to think in general about brand perception. Go and ask people to simply give you a bunch of adjectives, okay? And I've just simply put this in the slide so that you know the brief that people had in the past, okay? And these are some of the terms that we see, and hopefully you've looked all through these. Some people had a very liberal notion of what actually an adjective was. Hot, springy, that made me chuckle. Delicious, expensive, perverted, white obsessed, stubborn, ambiguous, inauthentic was kind of took me back, okay? Selfish, cruel, okay? A lot of images of kind of war crimes and, you know, mistreating people, and then a whole bunch of those comedy programs where they like to bash people and whatnot. Some people had this narrative that Japanese were considered to be super polite and refined, and till they lost it, and then they would suddenly be really cruel. That actually came through repeatedly from some international students' kind of images. And we can see a lot of these things here. So you can engage with them yourself. One that I keep coming back to is quirky. And this has repeatedly come up with in conversations with a dear friend of mine, Sven Pallas, who runs a branding consultancy and has written on Japan's brand. One of the interesting things is that Sven always argues that Japan has a lot of goodwill as a brand. And the image of Japan as kind of quirky, as a little bit eccentric, actually allows a lot of latitude for Japan to make a bit of a mess of things. You know, if the service experience is a bit off and whatnot, people think, you know, Japanese, it's very quirky. It's okay. And Sven argues that a lot of people bring goodwill to Japan brand. They're happy to give Japan a chance. They're not quick to default to negative responses, with the exception, unsurprisingly, of significant minorities, but significant minorities out of both China and Korea for historical reasons that are maybe more inclined to very quickly take a negative perspective. So with the exception of those two countries, generally there's a lot of goodwill towards Japan. Okay, now of course we have this broader set of issues of the pandemic and how countries have closed themselves. So what I'd like to do now is to put you into breakout groups, and please everyone put your cameras on when you get in a breakout group and share your own thoughts on what you think the pandemic and the way that borders have been closed, what are the implications for how you actually sell a destination? And I hope many of you had a look at the German campaign example, which they're running right now, which has already got 23 million views, the YouTube video that I've posted here on Zoom, which effectively invites people when they can't travel at this difficult time to dream of Germany in the future, okay? So I'll put you into the breakout rooms now. Thanks very much. It'd be very good if you could post any interesting thoughts or observations that came from the breakout discussion, not to the chat, but to the forum, because I'd like to continue this conversation. And I'm also going to post to the forum a talking point very specifically about how Japan's been communicating to foreigners what the current rules are for entering Japan, because there's some interesting takeaway lessons about how you actually communicate the key information that everybody wants to know, and which Michelle certainly could do with a lesson in. Right, so very, very productive. I want now to briefly just mention the timeline for all our activities in the course. I've put up a very detailed 2-page post on that. And let me just share the screen just so you can see exactly where I put it. Okay. Okay, so this is what you've got here. So the German example at the top there, okay. And we go down, then there's perception, the Oishimizu Plus campaign, which I'll speak to very, very briefly. And it lurks, hang on, where is it? Right up the top, Okay. And I actually moved around some content. So originally I had the overall activities and assessment and week one, because it was in week one that I made it all available to you, and the topic list. So I've moved them out of week one and I've put them all to the top, and right at the top I've put the time frame and the deadlines. So I'll be putting you in your groups next week, but we won't break out into the groups during the actual class. Instead, you'll use your own Zoom sessions and probably Line or whatever you want to use to collaborate. And that's very detailed. So you'll find out your groups next week. Very importantly, that first stage of sharing, timeline-wise, I really want you to have that done by the end of the following week, because then you've got to go back and do your own work. And as I say in the handout, there's nothing stopping you developing, and in fact, you should be very focused on this, developing your understanding, your skill set in terms of some really basic things, like for the video that you need to do by the end of the semester, shooting some video, editing some video, those kind of techniques. Get to work earlier on that rather than later. The last thing you want to be doing is 2 days before the deadline figuring out what video editing software to use, for example. Okay. A lot of people might be tempted to default to iMovie on their iPhone. Let me tell you, iMovie on iPhone is really, really crappy. It's good for super simple things. If you just want to take a bit of footage, you want to cut the beginning and the end off and stick a title on the opening image, but that's about all it does. It is just not up to the job here. So you're going to have to learn to do some other things. But I'll share a lot of resources actually, so you know where you're going with that. Okay, now I'll stop that share, and I want to turn to perception as a topic. So let me throw this up. That sounds horrible, doesn't it? Throw this up, sorry. Okay. So first of all, if someone wants to unmute and tell me what's the mistake in this from the most historically active historical drama that's come out of the UK for years, but they still screwed up.
There is a plastic bottle, right?
Yes, spot on. Okay. Thank you. And it's not just that of course, it's plastic, which is kind of translucent, but also it's just ubiquitous. Everybody has them all the time. And this is a really important thing. You just stop seeing the things that are so familiar in your environment. And it's always having this fresh set of eyes becomes important. This is why it's so good to have someone else read your stuff, to give you feedback on a text. Because if you've looked at a text that you've written, you often stop seeing the mistakes, simply because you're not really reading it anymore. All you're doing is looking at words, for example, as a prompt to you remembering what you want to say. So this is why we have editors, and why the editorial process is always separate from the content creation process. It's just a fresh set of eyes. Okay. In terms of a set of eyes, I'm not going to talk really about it here, other than just simply to mention eye tracking technology is now very affordable, to the point where students here from Amsterdam University College were able to do it in a student project, and they made this very nice video. Just also to mention very briefly about facts and figures. Mentioning statistics is often a very good way of intimidating other people who haven't done the research themselves, or who are afraid of statistics. As academics, we all know this. This is why the only really compulsory course in the entire SILS curriculum is a basic statistics course. We just want you to overcome the fear of statistics. And there's a very famous expression, lies, damned lies, and statistics, a very famous book called The Use and Abuse of Statistics. Effectively, if you can best perform statistical know-how, you can often win an argument quite unfairly, okay? At the same time, the visual representation of data is a booming field. And we're going to talk later on about this in another week. And I'm going to show you lots of nice visual examples from a truly beautiful book by David McCandless on the visualization of data. Now, One of the themes which is developed in greater length in the discussion of communications theory is all of the factors that get between the sender and the receiver of a message, okay? That how the audience perceives the sender will have a huge impact on how they actually make sense of the message. Of course, someone might speak with great authority, and some people may be convinced, but then others may say, he would say that because it suits him, right? It's in his interest. So of course he wants to say that. So very often, no matter how much genuine data or evidence you marshal or how good your arguments, if people question your motives, you're not going to get cut through. Also, the audience framing of the message, the cultural, their experiential, their cognitive prisms through which they perceive the message and also perceive the channels. If you have Amazon Prime, I suggest if you want to do a bit of binge watching, American Playboy is a superb dramatized documentary on Hugh Hefner and the creation of the Playboy magazine. Now, of course, we have this image of Playboy magazine as just about centerfolds, naked women, and very 60s and 70s tacky, alpha male culture. But actually, literally, lots of people did read Playboy magazine for the content. That actually Hugh Hefner was very much an intellectual, and he got some of the very best writers and intellectuals of the day to contribute to the publication. And that, of course, has been forgotten. And it's actually a whole bunch of people from the civil rights movement upon Hugh Hefner's death came out and said that the magazine did more than any other publication in America to give a voice to people who were arguing often very, very aggressive civil rights agenda. People like Malcolm X, the first time they had an interview with any kind of mainstream publication was actually in Playboy magazine. But of course, the perception of the channel was problematic for many. Of course, also the way audiences interact with the channel itself. And this key notion of agency, that audiences find their own purposes, their own use, their own value for communication acts, as I explained. Another interesting, huge field and a hugely exciting field, I just simply summarize it here and won't really speak to it now, is the field of behavioral economics, and particularly associated with Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Daniel Kahneman got the Nobel Prize for Economics, even though he trained as a psychologist. And Amos Tversky unfortunately passed away before the prize was awarded. Daniel Kahneman and his recent book, Thinking Fast and Slow, summarizes some of his work, but there's so much from them. They have done so many controlled experiments that have qualified the notion that we are economically rational. So in a whole lot of exercises, framing effects. For example, if you're at the races and you're losing money, your risk profile, your preparedness to take a risk will shift because you're losing. You really want to get back to at least zero. You don't want to end the day losing money. So you're in an incredibly weak position psychologically when you're in a weak position, when you're desperate, okay? Your risk profile shifts in ways that generally in the past, economists, for example, have assumed wouldn't happen. Fairness norms, endowment effects, so many things are explored. And if you're interested, I suggest you look at this. Kahneman tells the story that he was quite influenced by thinking about human perception when he was a young boy in France. He was French, Jewish French, during the Nazi occupation. And he was in constant danger, of course, of being deported to the death camps. And he was walking down the street, and he shouldn't have been in the street, but a German soldier approached him, and he thought, oh, this is it, I'm done. Little boy should not fear of being put to death. The German soldier walked over, picked him up, gave him a huge hug, and said he was adorable and reminded him of his own son and put him down. So he said that particular moment had always had him thinking about how we perceive some people and maybe the threat they present or the opportunity present, but they have an entirely different mental model at the time. The person was obviously sentimental, being away from home, missing his kids, and saw a boy in terms of a positive prompt to certain feelings. Now, a key aspect in communication design is to think about audience resistance. You get pushback from the audience, and a lot of this centers on whether you can change people's behavior. Now, Japan is full of instances of encouraging people to be behaving better. There's a bit of a voluntarist tradition, and this is hugely relevant to what's happened with COVID-19, that Japan, partly because constitutionally they couldn't, has gone down the path of this voluntarist encouragement approach rather than a legally enforced approach to require people to stay home and whatnot. And of course, sometimes that's been done with, the whole, Mitsu no Mitsu kind of thing, the three Mitsus. I initially groaned when I heard it first announced, but it does have traction. It is code, and people have cooperated. I mentioned in the post on last night that many of the models that were almost apocalyptic in terms of the fears that COVID-19 would kill large numbers of people in places like New Zealand, Australia, and whatnot, were predicated on the assumption that people just won't do what they're told. The modelers in the Australian case assumed that even if you told people it was a potentially fatal pandemic, that everyone would ignore it. And it actually turned out that people are incredibly cooperative. And so the cases fell to almost zero. Yet day to day, we can see instances where someone gets a bright idea to try and get people to do things that are not instinctively logical to them. And this is probably annoying for two reasons, maybe because of the example, but also because it's near the Waseda campus and you can't actually come here. So I'm sorry. Okay, I can now. You look at that, Nobody, they're telling you which side, to go up the steps. Okay, seems reasonable. But when you have a look at this can give you a bit of a hint. It's a little bit counterintuitive in Tokyo, but not in Kansai, that on the right side of the stairs, they're encouraging you to go up. Okay, and we see this in a number of places in the subway and JR in Tokyo. But what happens, of course, is that if you do the right thing and follow the signs, you've got some people coming down on the left and it works okay, but a whole bunch of people come down this way because on their left, because typically in Tokyo, you walk on the left, you stand on the left on escalators. So trying to nudge people to change is really difficult. So you often come face to face with people. And JR has been for several years trying to tell people on the escalators, you don't have to stand on the left, just one person on the left. Please stand next to a stranger on an escalator, and please stop walking up the escalator. Nobody does it because it's so counterintuitive. First of all, you don't want to stand next to a stranger. Secondly, most people think it's reasonable to allow a fast lane, just like in a traffic. You get over on the left if you're going slow, and if someone's in a hurry, they can go on the right. And of course, what JR has done is to double down with massive exaggerations. So even now, despite the pandemic, this campaign is still there, and there's still these messages constantly saying, about walking on the elevator on the escalator, they always say is "totemo kiken desu, totemo kiken desu," and it keeps repeating it, "totemo kiken." It's like, no, waving a sword around in a public place is "totemo kiken." It's like this notion that somehow if you exaggerate the risk involved in something, it will change people's behavior. Very opposite, it just causes audience resistance. So finally, and this is where I want to finish today, and I think I've got I think by my clock, 1 minute to go. This is our checklist, which we're going to come back to a number of times in the course, about what makes for a good message. It needs resonance, and this is the overall goal. Okay, it has to, at an emotional and or rational level, ideally both, it has to connect with the target audience. A lot of the COVID-19 messaging on social distancing has worked because it's both rational and emotional. Think of your grandparents. So it's both emotional and rational. You could be unwittingly infecting someone who then results in the oldies getting ill, okay, critically ill. Timeliness, it's got to be really critical message. There's an old French expression about thinking about a great reply to an insult, but unfortunately on the stairs as you're leaving the party or the meeting, rather than at the time. So resilience, the message has to stick, and it can't be vulnerable to subversive recall or redeployment. And I've got some examples there of where that's been a problem in the past. coherence. So it has to cohere with the message stream, and it has to cohere across channels. You should not be getting different messages through different channels from the same communicator. It has to come across as authentic. So it has to have this attribute of authenticity. And of course, particularly in terms of branding narratives, it has to have a sense of originality. It has to really have the distinctive signature of the sender. You know, if you see commercials for Apple, long before the logo comes, there is this very distinctive Apple look. And, you know, the shot on iPhone and all of those things, you kind of just know from the visuality right from the beginning that this is Apple speaking to us. And an appropriateness. It has to be aligned with the ethical norms of the target audience and all other stakeholders. So it may be timely, it may get people's attention, but you can get people's attention in really bad ways. Where the bloody hell are you? Every Australian knew about this campaign, and it was widely mocked, and you can see online it was parodied, particularly because this narrative of Australian friendliness and all the rest of it, when we just had effectively ugly race riots on beaches in Sydney, so that was parodied mercilessly, and the Tourism Authority had to drop it. So that's our checklist. It's relevant for everything we do in terms of interacting with other people. It's the way we present ourselves on social media, the way we present ourselves, of course, even in a job application context. But of course, particularly in corporate communications, which is our key concern, this is, I think, is a valuable checklist. So thank you very much. The theory, I'm saving you the talking head. I've got 2 videos which I've shot. I just need to do a little bit of editing and posting. And I tried to do that on my iPad Pro with iMovie, and it was horrible. So I gave up on that. I strongly recommend LumaFusion as an app. If anyone wants to play, I'll share that soon enough. That's a heck of a lot better. So I'll be using that, and I'll be updating the videos. And then next week, we'll be talking about design thinking. That will be our key focus there. There's some readings around that. There's some very good resources. So for next week, for our live session, please actively engage with the design thinking. And it has the added advantage that it's a really hot topic in so many companies now. And if you're going into a job interview situation to say that you've been studying design thinking, I think it really does help your branding, because it's so potent in terms of that timeliness attribute, which is second on the list there. So thank you very much for your attention, and stay, I won't say happy, but try to be nonetheless healthy in the context. And I'll let you go because I know some of you have a class in the next period. So thank you very much.